socialists. But I think the issue about, you know, the idea of declining circumstances for the working class, you know, which is a, sort of one of the things that you perhaps alluded to, being a factor in the socialist revolution, I don't think that that is right. I think that ultimately consciousness is the most important thing. I don't think that material circumstances play a role in socialist consciousness, and I think that's something that the party needs to really take up seriously. Good talk.
Can I perhaps?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, first thing, I sort of agree with what I think Andy is saying. That one of the things he's saying, anyway, which is that you know, there is this view expressed by some socialists, not many, that you know, before we can get socialist consciousness in a widespread way, things have got to get a lot worse. It's not been the prevailing party view on the whole, but you know, you do hear it expressed sometimes. You hear it expressed much more widely, of course, on the what I call the capitalist left, much more widely. You know, things are getting worse, and that will enable, when that happens, people will get worked up, and it'll sort of tip over into revolution, their kind of revolution. An old member of the branch of the Socialist Party, I'm in Swansea branch, used to say that we won't get socialism until capitalism has delivered a hell of a lot more, which is just the opposite view, really. And you know, I personally sort of tend towards more. But the real question I wanted to ask was, although you sort of gave some kind of explanation as to why you thought these end times beliefs sort of existed, people held them, I mean, what you said sort of seems to me to hold good for former times when there was sort of widespread ignorance of how things worked, if you like, scientifically, and when people's material circumstances were sort of very severe. Modern capitalism has sort of, to a certain extent, delivered us from some of that anyway. You know, widespread sort of education, you know, poverty's eased, etc. Why is that still going on? You might think that would sort of cause these scenarios that people dream up for themselves and spread among others to be sort of less popular, and people to fall for them less.
Yeah, that's a good point, and maybe not one with an obvious answer. With Christianity, I think end times beliefs have become much more prominent from the 19th century onwards, and even from about 100 years ago, there started to be published novels about the end times, and as I said, with the rise of smaller religious groups like Heaven's Gate and the Branch Davidians, with quite extreme end times beliefs in the last 10-15 years or so. So it does seem as if end times beliefs have become more prominent. It might be easy to dismiss that as pre-millennial angst, which I think was maybe sort of hyped up as a phenomena before we reached the year 2000. But I think also maybe one explanation as to why these beliefs have not only persisted but become more prominent over the last 50 or so years is partly because of technology and fears of technology such as the threat of nuclear war sort of obliterating everything, not necessarily leading to a utopia afterwards, but I think, yeah, it's partly that as science, or some of the applications of science have led to possible nightmare scenarios, even down to things like, I don't know, a genetically engineered virus accidentally being released and wiping out millions. You know, it's easy to have fears about science and technology, and I think that might have fueled some end times beliefs. But of course, that alongside that's the fear of increasing immorality, which I think is something which has gone on over centuries. Every generation seems to believe that the current generation is less moral than the previous one. So a lot of them seem to focus on a perceived spread of immorality as being another precursor to the end times. So I suppose it's that accelerating, you know, changes in science and technology and a perceived growth of immorality, maybe.
I think I might agree with that to some extent, because people I come across in everyday life and students that I've had in the past and things like that, in some of them there seems to be an anti-intellectual kind of streak, and it's part of their identity almost. You know, I don't, you know, I try to keep away from doctors and try and keep away from taking drugs and medicines and things like that, and do this alternative thing and whatnot. And most of what they're saying doesn't seem to be rational, really. A fear of immunisation and things like that. There's certain groups of people like that. And I think, and paranoia as well about, you know, the role of medicine and science and things like that. Maybe the government is using it to manipulate us or control us in some way. And I think, yeah, it seems to come with people structuring themselves in a way that is sort of anti-intellectual. For example, at the moment I'm sort of studying a group of spiritualists, you know, trying to see how they construct their beliefs. And interestingly, although this particular group is quite happy to make fun of itself from time to time, you know, which they seem to do quite spontaneously, they seem to be rejecting scientific things and constructing reality based on basically sort of superstition and misinterpreting chance events.
I think that maybe there's an irony there in that as most people in the West live fairly sort of comfortably, partly due to things like vaccinations or increased healthcare, that's given us maybe more luxury to then question things like vaccinations or genetically modified crops. Obviously that they should be questioned anyway, but I think these days, as maybe life isn't as difficult as it could have been, say, 100, 150 years ago, we've got a bit more freedom to be sceptical of science, even if that scepticism is channeled in an inappropriate way sometimes.
I suppose occasionally, you know, science does let us down, and so it reinforces that. Yeah.
You're going to kind of do this.
End time being, of course, are not a modern phenomenon. We had that in the past. Every time we got a new millennium, in the 11th century when it came in, thought was going. But do you think, to some extent, it seems to be largely concentrated on the United States, Canada, well, so much Canada, the United States, that this is a sort of a frustration, a reactionary frustration, because not so many years ago, of course, the great beast was Russia and Seven Heads and all sorts of things. So there's going to be Armageddon, and the hordes, the communist hordes are going to be defeated by the nuclear hordes of Jesus Christ, and whatever is going to be, whether the locusts or what. It develops in recent years. Is it a case of sort of frustration that the expected has not happened, so they're now casting desperately aside, apart from the fact that some of these people are doing very well financially out of it, this sense of frustration in that the expected, unexpectedly, has not happened. And the communist hordes in the East are now becoming very much like the capitalist hordes in the West. And they're looking elsewhere now for hitting out. To what extent, really, it's a sign of possible doubt spreading within the ranks of the faithful.
And I think you're right as well that each generation puts its own interpretation on the Bible. So as you say, you know, 20 years ago it would have been Russia. Now it's
it's probably Iran now.
Yeah, I'm sure that. So yeah, interpretations change through time. And you're right about mentioning America. I mean, most of the examples I gave were American. With the thing about dates, well, remember what I said about the Millerites, how they kept changing the date when the date passed and Jesus didn't come. So they then said, oh, you know,